Hey everyone, this is AMT for Deuces Cracked, and we're going to be playing a couple of 650 turbo sit and goes, one on full tilt and one on poker stars, starting just a few hands in here, still the first level. And I wanted to touch a little bit about the 650s in general. I'm just going to fold ace rag here on the button, and also a little bit about the differences between full tilt and poker stars, and I'm playing one 650 turbo on each of the sites. And I think this will help highlight some of the differences that you might find between the sites, between the regulars, between the multi-tablers, and often what is indirectly responsible for some of the differences that we might see specifically in the middle and late game lies in the structure changes that you find between the two sites. And specifically, the incorporation of the antes on poker stars is a very, very big change that you don't see on full tilt. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as the mid-game arises. The first level with the antes is 100-200 with an ante. The second 100-200 level on poker stars, so it's a few minutes away. And we'll touch on that when it gets there. As far as the players at this level go, some of the big things you see is that they love ace rag. As we can see on the left table, someone just instantly stacked off out of the small blind with ace rag. And you'll see that a lot at the lower levels, which is why things like being aggressive with ace-queen and possibly even ace-jack at times is appropriate in the early levels, when often it's not considered so in many situations in the higher buy-ins against some of the more thinking players. And over here I limped fives. It's pretty standard in single tables. I could raise there from the hijack, but I'd like to keep this pot small when the chips aren't as valuable in the first levels. And generally when I hit and I'm going to play a big pot, at this level someone's going to stack off regardless of whether I raise pre-flop or not. Those extra 60 chips won't mean too much in those spots. And I'm just going to check here. I'd like to stab if they both checked again, but the board is extremely draw heavy, and these guys peel very light even after the flop checks through. And you'll find that at the 650 level they peel much lighter than at many other levels. And that's why things like betting in multi-way pots, continuation betting in multi-way pots, often becomes dangerous on boards like that when you're facing multiple opponents, stuff like that. And another thing you happen to see a lot, which we see on the right table over here, is min raising. And it's pretty difficult to establish what players are min raising with all the time. It can certainly be with a wide range, and it can vary heavily based on the player. Very often I find that they can be small and medium pairs and medium Broadway type hands where players just think that there's an advantage to building the pot, but not so much that they want to play a huge one or are trying to play for stacks. So sometimes you do see that the min raises are indicative of the actual hand strength when you take a step back and kind of assess what they're doing it with and why they're doing it. But it does vary extremely between player types, so we are going to have to look out for that and not make too many blanket assumptions. The other thing is that there's somewhat of a contrast between wanting to play your hands aggressively and not wanting to get involved too much. You do want to start potentially expanding your range if you think that, for example, if you spot a terrible player at these games, you know he's going to stack off with any ace, you might want to open your range to those non-standard aces, even ace-jack, which is pretty much not a standard open for most multi-tabling sit-and-go players. You may want to look into that when you have a read that all these players are going to love ace-x and stack off pretty instantly. That also goes to say that you don't, with that said, you don't want to be too crazy, too aggressive, and willing to play too many pots without a big enough hand. Part of the advantage of single table tournaments is that you can kind of watch your equity rise and rise and rise as each player gets knocked out. So there is somewhat of a contrast there between wanting to stack all the worst hands and all the value that you could be missing out on by not raising some of those hands in these games. But at the same time, you're not going to be playing quite as aggressive and taking so many chances when it's so convenient to watch people get knocked out, basically not put your tournament equity at risk and be able to watch it increase, which is the large advantage of sit and goes and why a lot of it is very counterintuitive with push-fold frequencies and when you decide to do things like preserve your fold equity, things like that. Back to this gameplay, I do find that there was a hijack limper and a button raiser over there. I do find that the open limpers in late position are quite weak and will often fold to raises, especially as the blinds go up and it's the push-fold game. They'll often limp and fold to shoves. When they do call, it's with presumably pretty weak hands. But they do love to limp and fold, and that seems to occur on both sites. So I would encourage that when there aren't too many players, if the situation warrants, and hopefully we'll get into some of those, you can certainly push a little bit wider from the blinds and situations, in late position where you're trying to take the blinds down. And you have a limper right behind you, stuff like that. Might be situations where you can push a little bit wider at these levels. On the one hand, you do have players limp calling very wide range, but you can basically take thin value off that. If somebody's going to be limp calling ace-4, ace-7 offsuit all of a sudden is going to become a pretty healthy all-in move. And this is what I was talking about with the Broadway cards loving their overs. Ace-Queen's certainly not going to fold there. I'm actually just going to fold the deuces under the gun here. Now that we're at 30-60, I really don't have enough chips under the gun to make it worthwhile to play a hand like that at a full table. But yeah, as I was saying, it was very often occurs where people aren't going to let go of their overs. Or if they make top pair on a weak board, there are certainly a lot of overpair possibilities against tight multi-tablers when a player stacks off with king 10 there. Not to say it wasn't correct in doing so. Of course the player was stacking off with ace-queen, but you do have to be a little more wary about the hands you play in those situations, and that's why king 10 isn't a very playable hand. So often you're going to be out-kicked against any thinking or decent player. But of course you don't have to worry too much about those kind of players at these levels, so it is certainly to our advantage. And also addressing the structure a little bit more, it seems that the main differences are the fact that, on top of the antes that we touched on before, is that there are more levels on the full tilt structure, but that take shorter time. I think it's much more to the advantage of players playing lots of tables to play on PokerStars because of the structure and because of the fact that a lot of the regulars, especially at the 650 level, which is another observation I've noticed, call particularly too tight in the high blind game. And that kind of touches on what I said before about the limp folding weakly when it's kind of push fold time and you have late position limpers and are afraid of your fold equity. A lot of times they do fold quite often. So limping weakly certainly happens at all levels, but quite often at the 650s. So things like that make it much more to your advantage when considering and combining things like the antes to the equation to the point where that combined with the fact that stars is adding on 10-man sit and goes, all these things make it very useful for a player to multi-table sit and goes on stars if someone is trying to play high volume. I don't mind full tilt, but I have some issues with the structure. The software I'm not too fond of. The players do seem to be overall looser, though. and I do notice that on full tilt. So I would look out for that. I do think that a lot of the players will call shoves a little bit looser than on PokerStars. And I'm going to go ahead and fold these fives. Again, I'm just not deep enough to limp anymore. I do want to reiterate that I did touch on potentially taking more hands for value against the worst players that are stacking off with all sorts of hands. But I really do want to re-stress the ability and advantage to sitting back and watching people get beat up. It's very much counterintuitive to a lot of the cash game strategies that many of you adhere to, and I know many of you are cash game players. But just the way the sit and goes are structured, the way the prize pool is structured, is such that you gain every time someone gets knocked out pretty significantly, and of course more so as the bubble approaches, because everyone's equity is most delicate at that point. So, it still goes to show you that remaining more tight than anything is still profitable in the early levels, and you will loosen up progressively as the blinds warrant. Unfortunately, I don't have any situations so far where I have been able to loosen up. We are at the 5100 level. We're certainly entering the mid game here, but I'm pretty much just playing a consistent fold game with the cards I've been dealt. Extremely cold carded, but the fact is, the way the sit and goes go is it's quite frequent that you will be a cold deck not cashing in the beginning when you're playing multiple tables, and since the game is pretty much push fold soon, it's also double up or bust. So that's why these games happen to go really quickly in the mid and late game, and it really doesn't mean too much when you're cold decked early as far as win rates. The chances of you winning that particular game, it's really not too indicative of anything. Being cold decked is pretty common through the very short structures of the turbo tournaments. With 5-minute levels on PokerStars, we really have seen, not too many hands. And the same with full tilt, though they do incorporate more levels, and it does take a little bit longer on average to complete the games, which is another reason that I like playing on Stars. I believe you can get more games in per hour if you're multi-tabling. And that's a big advantage for hourly rates, which typically is the focus of most of the pros or people trying to grind up a bankroll. Hourly is a useful function, and how many pros would weigh their success. So just food for thought as to how to maximize that. And we're here at the 5100 level with aces in early middle position. I'm going to just make a standard raise to 300. Before the video started, I did have queens in the first level and had to shut down to a 4-way pot. I got 3 callers and an ace flop, so I pretty much had to just shut down. This is a good flop. A lot of draws hit this board, so I still expect to be able to play a big pot quite profitably, especially when he leads into me. And since stacks really don't warrant any other move, I'm just going to shove. He's calling with a ton of worse hands, so this is a pretty standard spot. There's really not much to analyze about this hand. You have aces. Folding would be truly horrendous for either of us once the villain led the flop. Bet folding when there's 600 more for the villain is terrible. Don't and I will speak to this to the viewers of the video as well. Don't bet fold in that spot, especially against short stacks. His fold is just insanely bad on that board, and there's really no opportunity to bluff because I'm that short. I'm gonna shove, and you're gonna have to call, getting huge odds, or you can just check fold when I probably have it. Especially if the players are at all thinking they're gonna see that I haven't been playing many hands. But in general, you just have to give up against the short stacks. There isn't a lot of room to bluff them. There isn't a lot of room to shove on them with the marginal hands that you feel you have a lot of fold equity on versus a lot of the other players. Things like this, when the button opens over here, there's really no way I could ever think about some type of re-steal or anything. He's simply too short. Not that my hand warrants it or anything. And in general, you won't see re-steals as often in single table tournaments as you will in multi-tables. But you do have to pay attention to stack sizes in any tournament situation. And 7, 8, 9, 10 big blinds, those are not 11, 12 even as you go deeper. Those are not appropriate re-stealing stack sizes, bluffing stack sizes, stuff like that. And I'm going to raise again. Same player is in the pot, so this is a great situation for me. There is a lot of weak limping on PokerStars, so I do expect the player to fold a good amount of the time here. And that was certainly not a great flop, but not one that I'm too concerned about with a limp call. I would actually hate that flop much more if it was a raised pot. So I'm just going to go ahead and lead out 665. It's kind of a random amount. I like to do that a lot, throws players off, and they actually like to play back at it more, I found. I really don't think there's a lot of a difference. So if you bet 700 there, or, if you bet 600 there, closer to pot, I don't know that there's too big of a difference, especially on that board. He's probably a player like that, especially after what we've seen of him. He's probably either going to go with it or he's not. Six-handed here, I'm going to shove the ace-10. I think it's actually somewhat thin, but I will do it, and I'm actually going to shove the ace-9 suited up here also. I ran into ace-king. It might be slightly thin at worst. I know ace-jack is pretty much unexploitable there. So, I did river him. Wow, running really well today. Ace-9 suited was a standard push. We had a really weak limper again there. We ran into kings, but that means absolutely nothing. Specifically not being results oriented, he bluffed in a terrible spot when we had aces the first time. He limp called and then folded that flop, and when I had aces the second time, and then when I have ace-9 suited and he limps there, with 10 big blinds and the stacks behind me, when we have a less than 10 big blind stack here and slightly more so over there, who I also presume to be calling very tight, haven't seen too much out of him. Very standard push spot. Ace-9 suited, I would pretty much never consider folding there. Specifically against that player from what we had seen of him. But the stack sizes warranted a push from a hand as strong as ace-9 suited. It was just very, very clear cut with the specific limper involved. And we have another min raise here. Hopefully we'll go to see a showdown, to kind of tell what type of hand he has. And I'm just going to shove it in on him. We have one big stack, which I don't want to play against, but other than that, it's a standard shove. He has ace-king also. Yeah, and some people are going to make these raises with big hands. You certainly do see it with ace-king, but again, I've seen it a lot more with some of those lower pairs, which I certainly didn't really want to see there. And also, some other Broadway cards and stuff like that. I'm going to go ahead and shove the 9-3. Small blind completers are terribly weak. And when small blind completers complete at that level, at the 75-150 level, and they have between 1,000 and 1,500 roughly, maybe a little more, you could go so far as to say 12, 13 big blinds, I'm certainly going to just shove. And here I'm going to shove as well. You have lots of fold equity. You actually don't gain much with an ace here by doing something like raising pre-flop, not all in. With a little bit deeper stack sizes with that ace down there, I would have done stuff like completing and betting most flops in a position where I don't think he's going to fold a lot pre-flop. And that does happen a lot at the 650s. A lot of players will call pre-flop raises and then shut down very quickly to flop heat. And that is the type of move that could help you a lot there. If you're in that 15 to 20 big blind stack size, you feel that you're going to get called way too light pre-flop, you can complete with the intention of betting most flops. And that does work a lot, specifically on PokerStars. I admittedly don't have as much, and I have to call this here with getting over 2 to 1. I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought there with that call. And yeah, I was saying you can complete and make moves like that when you don't think you have a lot of fold equity pre-flop, and it's just another form of bluffing that works quite often at these games. Especially, and as I was saying, I admittedly don't have a lot of experience on full tilt sit and goes. I have some at the higher buy-ins, but in general, I've played mostly on PokerStars, so I can speak to the PokerStars games being very weak like that. I will say that I think there's a lot more loose pre-flop calling at the 650s than the higher levels, of course. But I find that in general, they're similarly loose at both full tilt and PokerStars. And here with Ace-9 suited, I'm going to jam it in with 10 big blinds. It's a great spot. I did have this similar stack size last hand. But there was only one blind, and it was the big blind, which made the bottom of my range not worth shoving there. Here I'm also going to shove, very easy. With the 10 big blind stack size, a suited ace in the blind is perfect for shoving, and certainly unexploitable. And we are nearing the bubble on both these tables, but not specifically on the bubble, and I'm going to shove again here. And that allows us to take more risks than you otherwise would. When your bubble factor's high, you are also in danger of busting. We always talk about how villains will play particularly tight. They're afraid of going out. We're afraid of going out too. From a mathematical standpoint, we are afraid of going out. Now, we are going to be extremely more aggressive than our opposition. It's still right to do so, but there are more selective spots to do that than in these situations. On the bubble specifically. 5-handed, we don't have to worry about it because we're not in danger of busting, and we're not risking as much when we do bust because we weren't as close to the money. And I'm certainly going to call with Ace-King here against the reshove. I've been very active. Ace-King is a very easy raise call there. Keep running into the other Ace-King. I would expect to see hands like Ace-Queen and Ace-Jack equally as often. I really don't think he's ever folding a lot of the big aces here. So, hopefully we can get it in against one of those when we have Ace-King once. I'm gonna play weakly here. I'm not gonna go ahead. I'm at the point where my stack size with 10 big blinds is way too delicate. Now that I've turned a nice little hand, we can certainly bet. Turn the gut shot, so hopefully we'll be able to get some action. And he instantly folds, but I'm a little wary with my stack size. Certainly not going to be able to stab at that flop in an unraised pot. There's really not a lot of room to do that. And that's why when you're in between the 10 and 15 big blind stack sizes, that it becomes so much more difficult to play. Because you don't have room to do things like continuation bet, float, anything really, so it becomes very difficult. And we're on the bubble here. I'm going to shove because the big blind would be... I really hope he doesn't call too loose, but we have a short stack. And I don't want this big stack. While he could make a huge mistake and call particularly loose, I don't expect him to. He doesn't seem to be, and he hasn't so far, so I'm going to take the deep shoves because it would pretty much be a huge mistake for either of them to call very loose, and specifically for the other big stack to call with pretty much anything. I'm just going to fold the 5-4 here. It's nice to have the short stack on the bubble, but I imagine that a double up doesn't do much for bursting the bubble, and it would put him back to just about the size of the third stack. So the fact that he would be similarly stacked and we wouldn't really have a shorty anymore with one double up makes this a pretty delicate bubble situation, despite the fact that I'm in a commanding position here. I'm going to shove the king 9 again. Again, you don't want players playing loose against these raises. They're going to keep folding. They are very often going to keep folding, and it's not for a while that you're going to see them get pissed off and start calling, especially now that the small stack is in the big blind with 3 blinds left. In ace, we're just going to continue to shove. This is what we call owning the bubble, when we're in a perfect stack setup to basically own the competition. They can't maneuver against a shove, and they also can't call lightly because of how disastrous it would be. They could certainly look to spite call. I'm gonna. This is actually close. I'm gonna fold the 9-4 offsuit, overcalling here when. Actually, it would have been closer if he was all in too. That's definitely a fold. But actually, when a shorty goes all in, and you expect the other guy to fold in any situation, or both guys are all in, overcalling should be done pretty liberally at the against the really short stacks or extremely high blinds, and some people don't do overcalls, don't overcall light enough. That certainly would have been too light, but just to give the example. Right here, just wanted to see real quick. I didn't. Oh, right. Doubled up with a pair there. And this is what I was talking about. We had a quick change in fortunes, but really the stack sizes were pretty similar with the 2 short stacks, which creates a good situation for us in bubble owning still, but that actually creates somewhat of a psychological dynamic between the 2 short stacks. There kind of becomes a point where they say, hey, we're both the same stack size, I got a double up here, and then all of a sudden you start have diminishing fold equity and things like that, and stuff that you don't want to have, stuff that you don't want to see them call with, because despite the fact that you can own them with marginal hands, you still don't want to see them calling off their stacks. Because the point of being able to own them is the idea that you don't see them calling off with marginal stacks. I'm going to check Queen Deuce here. Queen Deuce isn't the type of hand that I would shove over one limper with this stack size. I would definitely need a better hand to do that. Picked up a flush draw. I'm going to check again. When you turn a flush draw there, especially on this board, it's really not a great idea to bet. You pretty much have to follow it up with a bluff on the river if you get one call, or, I mean, it's going to be pretty easy to get stacks in if someone's going to play with you on the river anyway, so I just don't see much point in doing that when you pick up a draw, especially when you're going to be more inclined to do things like take a card off or double barrel the river, excuse me. When you do things like that, you are basically creating a minus EV situation for yourself. You don't want to bet flush draws when you pick them up, especially on the bubble here. The bubble dynamic of sit and goes really does a lot to some of the way you play your hands, some of the passivity that is implemented. Definitely want to. I'm just gonna fold this. Actually, I was gonna make a standard raise there. I'm gonna shove 5s here as well. I was gonna make a standard raise with the Queen 6. But I had, been shoving an extremely huge amount, and I'm kind of afraid that the first time I don't shove, the second stack is going to want to play back at me a lot. The lower limit players, in addition to folding way too many hands at the higher blinds and stuff like that, is also that they get fed up much more quickly and don't care so much. So you do have to be careful of that. You do have to, and that goes along with just in general, realizing when your fold equity is diminishing. can't quite call here with 6-3 offsuit, but in general, you do have to realize when people are getting pissed off, when people start saying stuff in the chat box, or start limping incredibly high frequencies all of a sudden, stuff like that. All that kind of stuff is indicative of someone's range widening, fold equity diminishing. So those are things you have to look out for, especially as you approach the late game. I'd like to think that the bubble, people will play the tightest, but, again, there are times where people just kind of get fed up and say F it all. Just going to fold again. Again, a lot of people have the misconception that I'm going to fold here as well. The short stack in the big blind makes me very concerned with the fact that the small blind has me covered here. And I'm certainly going to shove this again. Stacks are still good, but owning doesn't necessarily mean shoving every single hand without fail. And that's important to remember. Oop, got called by ace-queen here. And there is selective ownage. You want to avoid that situation where your fold equity is going to diminish so much that you won't be able to own the bubble anymore. So it's a give and take. It goes to show you that these terms, these moves, aren't occurring in a vacuum, and there are moves that you have to make to account for them and be able to maintain your strategy. I'm going to shove the ace-4 here. Very easy shove against the 2.5 blinds behind. I'm also going to... Oh, boy. I do that a lot. I was going to reshove. I don't know why I didn't do it earlier. I was just confirming my move there. I was going to reshove that, so take note at home. Pretty much going to shove any two. He knows I'm shoving a ton, but he doesn't seem to be loosening up too much. I know we're heads up at this point, which could certainly loosen people's calling ranges, and diminish my fold equity. But this guy has shown no signs of even so much as upping the aggression when I fold. There were a couple of situations where I'm calling this. King 10 suited's a great hand here. Yeah, Queen 4 offsuit. Especially when a player does that, when he folds, and then the first time he has the opportunity heads up, he shoves. Not going anywhere. Sorry, I haven't been paying too much attention to this full tilt table. The stars action was much more discussion worthy with the stack sizes and the way we approach the bubble and everything. But yeah, that was a very quick ITM match. And one of the quicker ones you'll see once you get in the money. Jacks is, of course, a great spot to shove here. And now the blinds are high where we are going to be playing, very loose. You can't really shove queen deuce. But the fact that there weren't any antes on full tilt the entire time really has monumental impacts on some of our ranges. We didn't get into too many spots where the ranges were a lot different. Most of the any two spots, over small blind completers, stuff like that, occur on both sites. And I didn't see too many situations here where I would have shoved with antes versus not shoving without. So I'm sorry we didn't get to go into those, but those do happen. I certainly can't play the queen 9 against a min-raise. I do think that people will min-raise fold at the mid-game a lot more than they should, but I believe that happens a little more on PokerStars. When someone min-raises on full tilt, I'm finding that they're, especially with the mid and late game, as the stack sizes diminish, I'm finding that they're making those, the min-raise seems dumb a lot of the time, but they're making the correct call afterwards. They're not raise folding in terrible spots like we saw earlier on the other table. Wow, and running extremely good today. Very nice to see. Ace-king, there's just no way you can lay hands like that down, even with the bubble factor, with the close stack sizes. Those aren't situations where you're going to want to do that. I'm going to fold 7-8 offsuit here. Some of those connecting hands I'm not going to take advantage of, especially right after the bubble burst. Jack Queen suited here. I'm going to fold. I'm going to fold this. Again, it's very difficult to estimate your fold equity with these stack sizes, and I don't think I'm doing particularly well. You know, if he's reshoving if he's calling ace X, I'm certainly not in a situation where I want to be re-raising all in after his open. But I do want to put myself in situations where I get to shove into the big blind here. You know, he might call, but those are the most profitable situations. Those are the situations you really, really want to be in. When you're able to be the aggressor. When you're reshoving the queen jack suited, it might have been a decent reshove, but I don't see he hasn't been shoving a lot, and I had actually seen a bit of min raising out of him. So when he raises 3x, it's just not a spot that I'm too fond of getting into. I might have made a mistake in folding that queen jack suited, but I think when you consider the fact that you probably don't have a lot of fold equity, much more so on full tilt and poker stars in my experience, I think that quickly becomes a decent fold with those stacks for sure. So that's pretty much why I folded it. I really didn't think that I had a ton of fold equity. And I don't know that my hand was quite good enough despite that. But now we're just getting it in. And again, there's really no room to fold here. You know, you're better than the random hand that this big blind was dealt, so it just doesn't matter too much. And the fact that he folded is ridiculous. That's a great, I believe he was getting huge odds for that. I'm going to fold the jack deuce off. You know, I could very much use these chips, but they're a lot more inclined to call the short stack in general here, especially if as I've just doubled up from nothing. So that's very important to consider, I think. And now they're giving me walks. You know, it's going to be time to loosen up again. I have to shove any two here. It's going to continue to be any two as long as the blinds are this high, and as long as he ever has any opportunity to fold anything. And again, this is why I was doing things like folding to the raises versus not taking those chances with hands like the queen jack. I'm going to shove again. You know, it's 9-7, not a great hand, but the blinds are just too high. If he calls, he calls. But flipping here, I don't mind at all. You know, we're roughly a 60-40, and pushing 5 blinds there is absolutely fine. I wouldn't shove the bottom of my range on that last hand. You know, if I had something like 3-2 offsuit or deuce 7, you know, one of those really, really marginal hands, you know, you could certainly justify laying it down. But in a vacuum, that's certainly plus EV. You know, I believe any two would easily be plus EV in that spot. The stack sizes maintained plenty of fold equity still. You know, everyone was between 5 and 10 big blinds, which is the pretty much ideal stack size in terms of weighing fold equity and making loose shoves. And by the time you get to 300, 600, it's just too valuable on full tilt, despite the fact that they don't have antes in their structure. So it's important to note some of that. And it's specifically important to note some of the spots where your fold equity seems to diminish or can change rapidly, which I touched on before. You know, in any evidence you get from the actual player himself in his chatting and his frequencies rising, you have to be aware of that for your own play. Push spotting doesn't mean not taking advantage of those spots, and certainly doesn't mean going overboard. You know, there are very, very good players that push way too much. A lot of 2+2ers and players I've spoken with on the forum, winning regulars, just push too much or call too tight. There are several things that good players do, but there are situations to adjust. You know, and you're able to discern very often when those are, simply by noting some of the player tendencies and noting when the major situations are changing, when the blinds are finally affecting the play, when the blinds are finally starting to cause people to go all in instead of play a medium-sized pot, or cause everyone to get scared and start folding every time, you know, as it gets 6-5 four-handed, or as the stacks get super short, or if you see a short stack and you're near the money. All those situations pretty much warrant some type of adjustment with your frequencies. and it'll depend on the situation, but those are the types of spots you want to look for when deciding how you're going to change your game, what hands you're going to shove. There wasn't any two spot, with that last hand, for example, there was pretty much any two spot with those 5 big blinds when I had 9-7 offsuit. But I pretty much decided that while 9-7 was a shove, that I may not shove every hand in that spot. And in game, I probably would have, but that's the type of situation where if you're inclined to believe that the other two players are very much more overly active, you think there's a great chance that you're going to get heads up or something of that nature, then you can go ahead and fold those. We saw that one of the other players was particularly aggressive in the money, making non-all-in raises and stuff like that, and it seemed to be a situation where, if the small blind wasn't giving him a walk, then pretty much they would have been playing a pot all in, and I would have been able to move up into second place. But some of the factors to consider, and I hope you enjoyed the video and going over some of the differences between the sites, and I hope to continue to make videos, and will look forward to feedback on the forums. Thanks for watching.